What is the future for Africa's economic development? Over the years, periods of high hopes for the continent's prospects have swung to disappointment and back to hope again. Right now, it's fair to say the mood has turned a bit gloomy again. Many African countries have been whacked by Donald Trump's tariffs, which have upset their export markets. The United States, United Kingdom and others have slashed aid budgets, and climate change is adding to the challenges facing many fragile African nations, on top of the historic burdens of colonialism, slavery, and the scourges of debt, disease, and armed conflict, which have blighted it in the past. Of course, the true picture is much more complicated than this, and there is a more positive story to tell, one where a handful of African countries have, with careful planning and thoughtful policies, transformed their economic prospects, and where a population boom is creating the potential for future development and growth that have eluded most African nations in the past. So today on The Big View, we're going to talk about African growth, the past and more importantly, the future. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories in business, finance and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thal Larsen. Some people argue that it's pointless to try and generalize about a continent which is home to 1.5 billion people spread across more than 50 nations spanning different history, geography, culture, and language. Others maintain that the conditions facing African countries are so historically and geographically unique that it's a mistake to try to compare their economic development to the experience of countries in Asia and South America. It's fair to say my guest today disagrees. Joe Studwell is a journalist and academic who is currently a visiting senior fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. He spent much of his career living in and writing about Asia, but for the last 5 or 6 years, he's been involved in an intensive and in-depth study of Africa. He's written up his findings in a fascinating new book. It's called How Africa Works: Success and Failure on the World's Last Developmental Frontier. Joe Studwell, welcome to The Big View.
Hello, Peter.
So let's start with perhaps the obvious question. I mean, you spent a big part of your career living in and writing about Asia. Your last book, admittedly some time ago, was called How Asia Works. You say in the introduction to this book, the project began by mistake. What happened?
Well, it did. There were two mistakes, really. One mistake was the Ethiopian and the Rwandan governments asking me to go and see them. And I said, well, I don't know anything about Africa, so that would be pointless, even if it's lovely of you to ask me. And they said, no, you don't need to know anything about Africa. We want to talk to you about Asian development policy. And then the other one was a meeting with Bill Gates, who liked the last book. And with Gates, I talked for an hour about Asia. But at the end of it, he said, but what I'd really like to know is what you think about Africa. And it was these events that got me thinking, that perhaps there was something to be done. I knew it was going to be a huge project because there are 55 countries in Africa, and it was going to take a lot of time. But Gates, the Gates Foundation and Amidyar, which is one of the eBay founders, together said they were willing to fund the research, and that's how it started and kicked off.
And so you spent something like 7 years, is that right? I think on this.
I don't think it was as much as 7 years. It was It was 5-6 years in total. I wasn't doing it the whole time, but I was doing it a lot of the time. And it you can imagine, with stuff that you've covered in your career, that it you've got to get the historical backstory of different countries. You've got to, recognize that there are different drivers of economic development in different places. So it takes a long time, but I found it fabulous. I didn't have a bad experience in Africa, actually. And I met some really interesting, straightforward, get ahead sort of people. So I thoroughly enjoyed doing the work.
Because there's another potential challenge facing a book like this, which is how can you possibly generalize? As you say, there's more than 50 countries, different sizes, geographies, languages, political structures, colonial histories. So what made you confident that there was something that could be said that would be sort of relevant on a continent-wide scale?
I wasn't confident, but I got into it and I thought I'll if there are themes, I'm going to find out what those themes are. And yeah, in the middle of the project, I thought, I'm never going to find any commonalities here. It's just 55 different countries. But ultimately, as I pulled together more and more research, I began to see that no, there is a pattern in Africa, and it's a pattern that surrounds demographics, which was not something that I'd ever paid. This wasn't that I hadn't paid attention to it in Asia, but I hadn't ever needed to be concerned because East Asia and South Asia always had sufficient demographic density for economic development, at least after the Second World War. You'd have to go back into the 19th century to find parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, that were sort of problematic in terms of demographic density. But when I looked at Africa, what I realized was that was the major constraint on the continent. Now, when we think about Africa today, people, I suppose particularly in Europe and the US, are starting to get frightened by the population numbers that they're beginning to get familiar with. So the end of the Second World War, there were only 230 million people in Africa. Today, there's 1.5 billion. 2050, there will be 2.5 billion. And the end of the century, there'll be 4 billion people in Africa. So, the standard reaction to this is the Malthusian one that, oh my God, we're going to sort of breed ourselves to extinction. But the real developmental story in Africa is a different one. And it is that in 1960, at the time of independence, when some people were quite optimistic about African development, population density per square kilometer was under 10 people. Fewer than 10 people per square kilometer is not a lot. It's about the same as historians reckon there were in Europe in 1500. And in 1500 in Europe, how much growth was there? Well, there wasn't any growth. And the reason was there were not enough people. Today, we're just getting in Africa to the population density that we had in Asia in 1960. At the end of this decade, we'll be there. So even though it's, a couple of billion people at the end of this decade, in density terms, it's only getting to where Asia was in 1960. And that is hugely important because without a minimum amount of demographic density, it's really impossible to develop because you don't have markets. You can't afford infrastructure because when you work out the cost of infrastructure on a per capita basis, it's just too expensive to build a road or a reservoir or whatever per person. You don't get the division of labor that you get with more people, and you don't get a bunch of other what economists call economies of agglomeration. So when all that stuff is missing, you're really stuck. And that has been, and the core argument of the book is that has been the biggest constraint on Africa to date. The literature has tended to tell us that it's been problems of governance, problems of corruption, kleptocracy, problems of ethnic conflict, problems of other civil strife. But those, to my mind, have mainly been proximate problems. The fundamental problem is that Africa hasn't had enough people.
That's really fascinating. And I think, you even you make the point that this goes right back to even the sort of the pre-colonial period and the colonial period, that actually the way in which the colonial countries administered their African colonies was with relatively little investment or kind of oversight.
Yeah, we tend to look back at colonialism in Africa and focus on the fact that it was quite brutal, but it's more useful in understanding what happened in the colonial era to understand the finances of it and the the dearth of population meant that colonial governments couldn't raise tax, or they couldn't raise sufficient tax to do anything very much apart from put very small numbers of people, of foreigners, of Europeans in place, and then rule rural areas in Africa through either chiefs who existed already or chiefs who were put in place by the colonial powers. I mean, there's research that's looked at the colonial numbers that were put in place in terms of expatriates that were put in place in British colonies in Africa, and each colonial officer, which was usually a district officer, was looking after an area the size of Wales, which would be the size of New Jersey in the United States. And so you can imagine, with a horse, you're not going to get a lot done.
Right. That's probably right. So it's clear, as you say, the demographic picture is changing very quickly now. Now you sort of present this as clearly as an opportunity in terms of this enables certain things, but people also think about it as a risk. I mean, there's a sort of Malthusian argument, but there's also a sort of, I think the World Bank and others make this argument that you have lots of people who are reaching sort of working age in Africa, and just there are insufficient jobs to support them. Then what happens? I just wonder how you sort of think about the balance of opportunities and risks.
I think obviously there are huge risks, but the point I make in the book is that you've got to have these people in order to be in the developmental game. Because if you don't have sufficient density of people, at least, as I say, what we had in Asia in 1960, you're not gonna get your economies moving. I came away from it preferring to feel optimistic, but I think you can look at the situation and be very pessimistic if that's the kind of person that you are. I feel somewhat optimistic because the bit of the economy of Africa that you would expect to respond first to greater demographic density, which is agriculture, as was the case in Asia, is responding. So since 2000, we've had average agricultural growth, value-added growth per year in Africa of about 4.5%. All right, so that's the fastest rate in the world. You wouldn't expect most places in Asia to be faster now because they're relatively mature in terms of their agriculture sectors. But nonetheless, it's pretty impressive. And you can look around the continent. Look at Nigeria, as one often has to because it's the most populous country in Africa, frequently described as chaotic, ungovernable. But since 2000, the data show that agriculture has been growing at nearly 6% a year, right? So that's pretty impressive for a chaotic, ungovernable country.
So you talked about how Ethiopia and Rwanda sort of were interested in you talking to them about the Asian development, and you write quite a lot. Ethiopia and Rwanda are two of the sort of the examples that you explore in terms of where there's been some lessons to be learned in part. But I'm just wondering a bit about that comparison with Asia, because what sort of strikes me about the Asian development story was, and what I took from your last book, How Asia Works, was really that they did things that were against the sort of the economic orthodoxy of the time, right? So that the countries that successfully developed in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they had tariffs, they had capital controls, they didn't open up their markets in the way that sort of the consensus, the economic consensus would have suggested. And yet what you've got here is but they didn't really there wasn't a template to follow. They were just doing things differently. Whereas here it seems like there's a more conscious effort to try and say, well, it worked in Asia, maybe it can work for us too. Is that fair?
I mean, that's fair for Rwanda and Ethiopia, which have very, very definitely been trying to replicate Asian models. I mean, Rwanda, very interesting, is very focused on the Singaporean model, which sounds ridiculous, right? Because Singapore's this little island on the main shipping lanes of Asia, and Rwanda is bang in the center of Africa. But actually, when the Rwandans explain to you their logic, it does make some sense, because they say, well, we are so remote, and the cost of moving things here by truck is a multiple of what shipping from Asia or wherever costs. We can actually use our isolation to produce manufactured goods that wouldn't be competitive in the world economy, but are competitive in the center of Africa. So them and the Ethiopians, where there's just been a phenomenal appetite to absorb the lessons of development elsewhere. I mean, people are fantastically well read. Every other minister seems to have done a PhD on the side while being a minister, and the PhDs are all kind of looking at developmental problems. So they are like that. Other countries, I would say, are sort of less aggressively thinking that they're going to replicate what's happened in East Asia. But in a country like Nigeria, you'll meet politicians like the current vice president, who are very interested in learning lessons from East Asia. And then other countries, again, you don't get a lot of direction to the sort of developmental thinking, but that isn't quite the end of the world, because what we see in Africa, and this is quite different to Asia, where most development was state-led in some way or state-orchestrated in some way. What we see in Africa, in other African countries where there isn't strong political leadership, is we see the private sector leading. So, and most obviously at the moment, because of the growth, 25 years of accelerated growth in agriculture now. So we see the private sector really being very active in the manufacturing bit of agriculture, which is basically making processed foods, everything from milling grain to actually producing packaged foods. And already we see a pattern where quite big companies are coming into being, working across 8, 9, 10 countries, producing enough cash flow then to go into other businesses. So in Tanzania, one firm I talk about a little bit is Buckrazer. It's the biggest agribusiness in Tanzania, started in milling, bought mills in different countries when they were privatized by African governments. And now they're in everything from petroleum products to real estate to a TV station, and I think they've got a football club as well. So, and quite similar. I mean, Peter, I'm sure you'll see the analogy or the comparison here, quite similar to those kind of Christmas tree businesses that grew up in Southeast Asia. So you think of like CP Group in Thailand, or the Salim Group in Indonesia, or Astra sort of, in Indonesia.
Sort of big conglomerates doing lots of different things.
Yeah, but they all come out of agriculture. They all originally come out of agriculture, and then the cash is there, and they go and pursue a bunch of different opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So this is maybe a good segue. I mean, you've talked about agriculture as being one of the key sort of things to solve, or is in the process of being solved, perhaps. Then there's manufacturing, and obviously manufacturing was a huge part of the sort of the Asian development, for the successful Asian development. I mean, I guess the counter argument would be today that manufacturing has changed. Everybody's adopting robotics and artificial intelligence. That maybe it's a little bit sort of the way people talk about India as well, is that the opportunity to do in Africa what was done in South Korea and Taiwan and other places that moment has gone. How do you think about that argument?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that technologically manufacturing is changing, but very slowly. But I think that, when you get very large, very low cost labor supplies, that people remain very competitive against robots and AI. Manufacturing wage rates in Africa now are like $65 to $90 a month. Compared to 600 or 700 in China. And then if you compare that with robots, I mean, if you look at garmenting, the sort of absolute lowest value added area of activity that countries first go into, a garmenting robot, which actually isn't a garmenting robot usually, can't do a huge amount of stuff because material of its nature is flexible, and robots like you working with solid things. But it's not going to cost you less than $100,000. And the problem with robots and putting robots into factories is you pay up front the full amount. You compare that with bringing labor in and laying labor off, which in poor countries you can always hire and fire labor as you want it. To a lot of manufacturers, that's a lot more attractive at $65 a month than potentially overcapitalizing a manufacturing line. So I just don't think that we are at the point where, if you've got sufficiently affordable and reliable labor and political stability, that manufacturers are going to say, no, we'd rather work just with robotics. I think the more the more serious challenge to Africa's ambitions in manufacturing is the competition that there will be from Southeast Asian states that still have a lot of low-cost labor, so Indonesia and South Asia. So is India going to bring a very large number of people into manufacturing? And if they do that with really good government support, then that, I think, can be more problematic for Africa. But still, at the end of the day, one thing that Africa very much has on its side is the logistics relationship with Europe. North Africa, totally so, right? Morocco, you're 14 kilometers from Spain.
Yeah. You mentioned two important words there: political stability. I think it's. Obviously, it's very easy to say that there has been a history of particularly civil war, right, in Africa. But also, I think it's one of the things that's striking to me from reading your book is that actually, even against that backdrop, some countries have managed to do very well. You talk about Ethiopia, which obviously had the terrible famine that we all remember from the 1980s, and then a period of growth, but also a kind of a really gruesome sort of civil war in the 2020s, and yet the economy has continued to grow. And Rwanda came out of this terrible genocide and has yet sort of managed to, and has had a lot of political upheaval and still managed to kind of keep growing. I wonder how you rationalize that. You would, from the outside, you would look at that and say those two things are inconsistent.
Again, I think one can look at Africa today and be an optimist or a pessimist in terms of conflict that you see going on around the continent. To me, the main concentration of conflict and coups that we've seen in recent years has been the Sahel region, where you have a very particular story. It's a very particular environment. It's very impacted by climate change. And so forth. And I don't think that is symptomatic of a political malaise more generally. But do you see conflict in other places? Yes, you do. We can't deny that. And the ethnic diversity of the continent is at the root of this. And again, it goes back to demographics. Historically, thousands of different ethnicities could survive in Africa because population was so low, and there was actually very little, by European standards, very little conflict between different groups. And if you got in a disagreement and an argument, you could move off and find new land to inhabit. So the ethnic strife is going to continue to be a problem. Ethnic conflict is going to continue to be a problem. I think, though, that one positive that I would point to, maybe not normally one that's pointed to, is that if you look at protest in Africa over the last, say, 5 years, and you look at protests that we've all seen on the TV in Kenya, in DRC, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, what's quite striking to me is that you see more and more evidence of protests being cross-ethnic. You see different ethnic groups, so it's no longer about I'm this and you're that. It's about the issue. And I would actually sort of point to that as potentially the front end of a positive trend in Africa. But that said, unrest will continue to be a problem. We've just got to keep it in a bit of perspective. I mean, if you look at the number of people who've been killed in incidents, in wars or domestic unrest involved with more than 1,000 casualties since 1960, it's reckoned to be around 6 million. Well, 6 million is the top end of the estimates of the number of people who died in Europe in the Napoleonic Wars, right, which were like a dozen years. So you've got to have a bit of perspective on this. It's kind of too easy for us to look at Africa and say, oh, they're violent people. I mean, anybody who knows the history of Europe would say we are extremely violent people.
Yes, no, absolutely, yeah. Well, and not that you want to get into a numbers game, but when you start looking at people who died in China during various Great Leaps Forward and things like that, famines. One thing I'm just curious about, because I think there's two things that sort of probably feature less in your book than in the sort of the most of the discussion about Africa that you hear or read at the moment, which was basically debt and China, and there is this issue with a number of countries that are very heavily indebted, and trying to get out of their debt, complicated by the fact that they've also borrowed heavily from China. There is this whole argument that China's sort of somehow trapped these countries into a debt dependency. I just wonder. I mean, obviously, again, it's quite hard to generalize from country to country, but how do you think about that issue when it comes to Africa?
The first thing I think about is that African lending to infrastructure projects and power projects in Africa has brought capacity and resources that just would not be there otherwise. So if you add up what principally the Chinese policy banks have lent, but other banks as well, it's about $150 billion. Okay, and that money was not going to come from anywhere else. So I would say that that's been actually very important to African development and Africa getting some basic infrastructure resources in place to begin to take advantage of its demographic growth. That said, has China overlent to some countries, and has it been opaque in the extreme in the agreements surrounding that lending? Yes, I think that's certainly true. I mean, for instance, Angola, which is the biggest China debtor, we just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, but we just don't know really what exactly is in those loan agreements,
which is part of the problem.
Yeah, which is part of the problem, but it's but I don't see this as a Chinese conspiracy. I think that they really did, how they do everything as a campaign. I think they really, did think that they were taking over the world, and they were going to lend all this money to Africa, and it was all going to get paid back. And they made some very poor decisions along the way. That has to be cleaned up. I mean, what I'd say from an African national perspective on this is that the the number of countries in genuine debt distress is a small subset of all those in Africa. And one way or another, as with all debts, it's going to have to be resolved.
Yeah. But you don't see that as a sort of a lasting impediment to development?
No, I don't think so, because I think most Chinese lending in Africa has paid for infrastructure and utilities that were needed.
Right.
And in general, China has delivered those construction projects at a big discount in cost terms to what it would have cost to get the work done by European or US firms. And that's what we tend to forget, right? I mean, as with everything, China has cut, half or more off the cost of doing infrastructure projects.
Yeah. We're running out of time. I just sort of just wanted to end on a, as you said, you chose to be an optimist about this. I thought there's an interesting sort of line at the end of the book where you say, if you live outside Africa, whether in the Americas, Europe, or Asia, Africa is going to be a bigger part of your life in trade, investment, tourism, literature, and music. You sort of compare it almost to the sort of the impact that Asia was beginning to have in the 1960s and has had since then, which is quite an intriguing prospect. I mean, sort of, how would you advise people to prepare for that?
Well, I mean, there's lots of interesting places to go and visit in Africa. Mm-hmm. And if you want, people of our sort of generation, if you want to see the deserted beaches that you saw in India or Southeast Asia in the 1980s, then you really need to go to Mozambique or Togo, right, or another African country, because those are the only places that you're gonna see that. And yeah, it is the last frontier in that respect. And it's also kind of a nice place to go if you're coming from Europe, because there's no jet lag, right? It's all pretty much the same time zone.
I see. Okay. Well, you're doing it. You've got a bright future as part of the African Tourist Board or something like that, Joe, if all else fails. But I won't ask you which continent you're going to write about next, but we can leave that for another time. But this was really fascinating, Joe. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
That's all we have time for this week. Thanks to Joe for that fascinating discussion. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich with the help of Mike Copeland and John Hodge in the studio in London. You can check out a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday. Don't forget to tune into our sister show, Viewsroom, every Thursday, and all the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions, and ideas, please email us on breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you like what you heard, please rate the show, leave us a review, and check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.